we fundamentally, through a mix of bad intelligence, wishful thinking, projecting our values on Putin, got the fundamental direction of Russia wrong. And we did the same in the case of China.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future.
Hello, my name is Jared Monshine, and welcome to another episode of the United States Study Center's Briefing Room. Joining me today, I have one of the most well-known and accomplished journalists in my view, all of journalism, a leading national security reporter at the New York Times, where he has been for now over 4 decades at this point, with unbelievable expertise on everything from NATO and European security to Asia security. He just knows it all. I am unbelievably honored to be joined by David Sanger, who is joining us at the U.S. Study Center this week as a visiting fellow and is also on a book tour for his recent book published in April called New Cold Wars. And this is available at all bookstores and has already become a New York Times bestseller. So, David, thank you so much for joining us today. I really wanted to start off our conversation today, at least to start things off, just you wrote this book. This is not your first book. This is, I believe, your 4th book, if I'm not wrong.
That's right. You'd think by now I would learn how to go do them, but
but this one you just can't put down. There's no way to skim read it. There's no way to skip through it. So could you maybe give our listeners just a quick overview of the book and why you wrote it and maybe how you wrote it? Because I think some folks might hear New Cold Wars and think it's another think piece in some sort of international affairs journal, but that's not how you took this the reporting you did on this book.
Well, this is, as you suggest, Jared, and it's great to be back here and great to be back in Sydney and in Australia. This is a book of reporting, and a reported book and a narrative book are very different from an academic book. And I hope it reads to your readers, as it sounds like it did to you, as it's foreign policy, but reads more like a cross between a novelistic thriller and an insider memoir. And that was at least my hope. The core of the book is to answer the question, how did we get the biggest geopolitical problem that we're facing today wrong? And that is to say that when I came back from 6 years of covering Asia, I was Tokyo bureau chief for the Times. In 1994, exactly 30 years ago, there was a widespread assumption that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the next few decades would be about the other major rivals, Russia and China, gradually joining the West, each in their own way, but for very different reasons, but with one fundamental common goal, which is to improve their economic situation by mixing in with Western markets, the Russians selling oil and gas to Europe and beyond, the Chinese selling everything that they make and improving their technology, and becoming members of the World Trade Organization, which happened just 5 or 6 years after I got back to Washington, and thus integrating with the West. And it turned out that while that was the progression for a good number of years, we fundamentally misunderstood their goals, that we downplayed all of the evidence that they were going off in very different and in some cases highly authoritarian directions. They didn't do that on the same timetable. The Russians headed there first. The Chinese caught up after Xi Jinping took power. And that our fundamental assumption that economics would triumph over their desire to grab more territory or consolidate rule by getting rid of dissidents, ethnic groups that they thought were threats to their rule of law or part of their territory, that that whole concept that economics would prevail first turned out to be wrong in both cases. So the first 150 pages of the book are sort of a anecdotal walk through how that happened. After the book opens with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, which was no surprise to the United States, but shocked the Europeans and others who had ignored the evidence. It turns back to a trip that I took with President Bush to St. Petersburg in 2002, when it was shortly after 9/11, and he was trying to put together a consortium of countries to battle terrorism. And we ended up on a yacht going down the Neva River with Putin and his wife, Laura Bush, and George W. Bush. They had just been together to a strange reinterpretation of the Nutcracker that Bush did not appreciate very much. It was done by a former Soviet dissident. So the idea that this person had been invited back and could operate in a newly free Russia was sort of interesting. During the course of the float down the river, Putin talked about Russia eventually joining the European Union. And there was even discussion around that time that Russia might one day join NATO, the alliance that was created to go contain the old Soviet Union. This was mind-blowing stuff. It also turned out to be something that didn't happen, that while Putin may have believed it in 2002, by 2007, he was already warning that Russia had been stripped of territories that really belonged to him. Pardon me. And that he gave a fiery speech at the Munich Security Conference that Bob Gates, then the Secretary of Defense, had to stand up and respond to by saying, I've already been through one Cold War. He had been CIA chief during that time. I'm not really eager to enter into another. 7 years later, Putin annexed Crimea, and the U.S. and its allies were very slow to respond. It took a year to put sanctions on. A year after that, Angela Merkel and Putin signed the Nord Stream 2 agreement to create a gas pipeline that ran around Ukraine, from Russia around Ukraine, so the Ukrainians got none of the value from it, and into Europe. And Merkel declared that Putin was a reliable supplier. This was just 2015, 9 years ago. And then, of course, he attempted to take the rest of Ukraine 7 years after that. So we fundamentally, through a mix of bad intelligence, wishful thinking, projecting our values on Putin, got the fundamental direction of Russia wrong. And we did the same in the case of China, although it came later. It was a democratizing, liberalizing society very slowly until Xi Jinping came along. And contrary to all of the intelligence estimates that had greeted his arrival, had tried to explain it, he ended up turning China inward, using technology to build a quite remarkable system of control that uses everything from facial recognition to monitoring of the internet, of communications, of cell phones, and so forth, to make sure that there was no opposition to his rule and no true dissent. So it's the exact opposite of what the West thought was going to happen, which was the internet would slowly seep into China, undercut the Communist Party, and set the Chinese people free.
And nail Jello to the wall.
Well, that was what we heard from Bill Clinton, who said that trying to control the internet was like trying to nail Jello to the wall. And it turns out that the Chinese are exceptionally skillful Jell-O analogies.
That's true. Now, I guess one question I have is, you say we got China's rise wrong and Russia's resurgence wrong. At the U.S. Study Center, we talk a lot about the U.S., obviously, but in many ways, we talk a lot about alliances across the world, but especially in Asia and then Indo-Pacific. And one thing that I find really interesting is the way that allies have looked at Ukraine and how, in some instances, some European allies, I'd say maybe the UK, have been ahead of the US on arming Ukraine in some areas.
Absolutely.
And you've been, again, a world leader on basically getting all the scoops on this. One question I have, though, is do you find Asian allies of the United States to be ahead of the US in some areas? And if so, where?
So I don't think that they have been ahead of the U.S. in the recognition of China's potential for disrupting the region, but they weren't far behind. And I think when we look back at the Biden administration and his one term, it will be a highly consequential one, sort of the way George H.W. Bush's one term was also highly consequential. He ended up managing the transition from the Soviet collapse through the Cold War. And I think Biden will be remembered for managing the reconstitution of American alliances to stand up to Putin and to begin the formation of not an Asian NATO, but the working elements of it.
The lattice work is how Jake Sullivan likes to refer to it.
Not a bad phrase, because what he has done is put together the Japanese and the South Koreans, who nobody thought could agree on anything, including the time of day or what to order for dinner at their summit meetings, in an uneasy but workable partnership to confront Chinese influence throughout the region. He has now brought in the Philippines. AUKUS, whatever you think about it, too expensive, dragging Australia into the confrontation with China, is a way to assure that Australia, and by extension New Zealand, the other Five Eyes member, to this same effort by assuring that there is deep participation and integration in Asian deterrence and defense. Now, we don't know if AUKUS will survive future American administrations. I actually think it probably will. We don't know if future Australian administrations may have second thoughts about it. I think at the end of the day, they are going to decide that their better effort is to ally with the United States, Japan, South Korea, that those are the natural democracies that they need to be set up with. That structure did not really exist before Joe Biden came to office, and I think that will be one of the better achievements of the administration.
Do you think that in getting some things wrong, do you think that the U.S. not only got China and Russia wrong, but maybe got our allies wrong? For example, you've highlighted the role of Germany and even now the present role of Austria in their relations with Russia. Do you think that the U.S. did not pay enough attention to the agency of U.S. allies and partners in this new era we find ourselves in?
So I don't in the case of Germany. I think in Germany, Biden did a pretty good job of bringing them in, and you've seen that now in the German willingness to send arms, not just helmets, to the Ukrainians, but also in the German plans, and so far they have not been fully executed, to build up their own defenses for a world in which they're probably facing 30 or 40 years of Russian hostility and threats to the core of NATO. Now, whether or not they deliver on that depends on the nature of the relationship they have with future administrations. And I think that would look quite different if Donald Trump came back into office. And I think that's one of the big questions about the Biden administration is, will the changes it has brought about last, in this regard? So that's, a very big factor. I think the next question that we're going to have to confront is the one that you mentioned of agency, which is alliance management means getting an ally to do what you want them to do, but make them think it was their idea. Right?
Sounds like AUKUS.
That's right. That's right. And that means stepping back and not taking credit and recognizing that everybody else's political system is as or more dysfunctional than our own, although in the American case, that's a pretty high bar these days.
That's a really good point. In terms of the agency maybe of Asian allies, I find it interesting during the Obama administration, it seemed to me that in some ways they did not necessarily engage with Putin unless they engaged with or spoke to Merkel beforehand. And a lot of times it was maybe the history and the architecture of NATO sort of solidified this. Whereas in the Obama administration in Asia, on the other hand, in the early maybe first term, they did not necessarily consult with allies before talking to Beijing. Do you see? Did you see that firsthand yourself? Is that a correct analysis of how the Obama administration saw it, or if it is remotely correct, do you see a difference in how subsequent administrations are engaging with China?
So the Obama folks did not consult as much with Japan, South Korea, Australia. They would say they, of course, were bringing in allies. There is informing and then there is truly consulting, right? Informing is, I'm going to give you an early heads up. I'm going to do this anyway, which is usually my experience with, say, teenagers. And consulting is, we were thinking of doing this. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you want to join? I don't think that Japan and South Korea were in a place yet where they were ready to be concerned enough about China to sort of take that position. They were, China is a huge market for South Korea, and particularly for the electronics sector, for Samsung and others. It took a lot of time and a lot of confrontations with Beijing to bring them around to becoming a full member of this defensive alliance. I think it's helped that in the Ukraine war, North Korea has really signed up on the Russian side of the war, has supplied them with millions of rounds of artillery, only half of which work, but, it's North Korea. And suddenly, I think the South Koreans have recognized that for them, Russia is part of the North Korea problem, not part of the solution. That's a very big change. Back in the days of the six-party talks, the Russians, the Chinese were all on South Korea and the United States' side of the table. And that would no longer be the case if you could organize the six-party talks again, which you can.
That's a great point. I guess on the reverse of agency is sort of, we talked about the structure versus the agency of the alliance. And one thing that I'm seeing structurally is, you just touched on how, six-party talks would look very different if they were to occur, because I think Russia is taking a different tune on North Korea, as you said. Do you structurally see any sort of off-ramps to what our own polling finds is continued convergence amongst U.S. allies and partners on challenges, but also in terms of geopolitically, the way that Russia, Iran, and North Korea and China continue to converge in some areas? What is sort of the off-ramp to these, what appear to be sort of structural challenges, where they're as your book says, new Cold Wars? We're seeing a sort of a breaking apart of these ties. At a certain point, the U.S. can only sanction so much in Russia and China. And, is there an off-ramp to complete decoupling between the U.S. and China and Russia? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, the first question is, are we looking for an off-ramp? And so far, I don't see very much evidence that we are. At the last press conference that he gave before he announced that he was dropping off the ticket, I asked President Biden, is it the policy of the United States to seek to interfere with the Russia-China partnership over Ukraine and everything else? And he wound around. I had to sort of drag him back to the central question again, a question that we met both because we wanted to hear the answer, and it was a bit of a cognitive test at the time about how he was sort of developing policy. But he finally came back and said, yes, it is our policy to interrupt that relationship, but I'm not going to tell you how, which leaves the lurking thought that maybe some of this is covert, an effort to try to interrupt the shipment of high technology goods between China and Russia that they've been using to rebuild their military. We haven't seen the evidence of that program yet, but we've seen the evidence of efforts to enforce sanctions, threaten the Chinese with the kind of expanding sanctions and export bans that would happen if they continue to support Russia.
One thing that I liked about that press conference is you omitted the fact that President Biden then said, basically, David, be nice to me, because I know you're a tricky one.
Well, he's known me for a while. When he looks out at the press corps asking him questions, I think I'm among the extraordinarily few who he recalls covering him when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was some number of years ago.
Which only highlights how valuable you are to still be in the role you're in and to be publishing the books that you are publishing, because the state of journalism today, it's really hard to find people who have the decades-long experience and insights that you do. So one part that we do of our podcast here is share a stat or figure that we think is relevant to today's conversation. Do you by chance have one available for us today?
I've got a few, but let me give you one of my favorite. It's 20%.
Let's hear. Why 20%?
20% is the percentage of the semiconductor production for high-end semiconductors that the Biden administration estimates would be made in the United States under their program to rebuild American industry by 2030. Now, I don't think they're going to hit 20%, because right now we produce about 0% of the most advanced semiconductors that we use. There are several plants under construction that should ramp that up, but I think it's going to be a slower slog than the Biden administration suggests. But let's assume for a moment that they're right. What does that mean? It means that 80% of the most advanced semiconductors, these are the semiconductors that you use to develop large language models for artificial intelligence, to build advanced weapon systems, to build the control systems for the submarines that you're going to be using in AUKUS, that 80% of those are going to come from outside sources, mostly Taiwan. Okay? Now, supposing I came to you with a business plan, Jared, and I said, I've got a great idea. We've got one manufacturer called Taiwan Semiconductor that is capable of making this stuff for all of us, for the Chinese, for others. And our plan is to put most of their plants within 100 miles and easy missile range of the Chinese People's Liberation Army rocket forces. You might say to me, Jared, David, it's a big world out there. I'm sure you can find some place that's a little further from those missile launches and maybe has lower rent, and that we could go do that. But that's not the world that we live in, unfortunately.
It is not, but it is a world in which we have unbelievable expertise joining us in Australia. That is a fantastic stat and bewildering outcome. But I could not be more grateful for your time, David, not only for today's podcast, but joining us at the US Study Center this week. And I very much look forward to continuing to read your unbelievable output, both in books and in columns and analysis. You truly are not just a national treasure in the U.S., but a global one for the insights you provide.
Well, thank you much. It's really been great to be back in Sydney, and particularly great to have a few days to get to know people at the U.S. Study Center, which I think is a new and wonderful, not so new now, but wonderful treasure of Australian expertise about the nature of a relationship, and it's really been great to be here.
Thanks, David. And for the record, I didn't coach you to say that last part.
No,
I very much appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Thanks, David. As we wrap up, I want to highlight that there are a number of other podcasts that the Study Center puts out. Not only do we have this briefing room, but we also have the CEO, Mike Green, his podcast, The Asia Chessboard, which he does with the CSIS think tank based in DC. We also have the USSC Live series, where you can hear our live events, including our Election 2024 series. Thank you again for listening to The Brief.